Welcome, everybody, to the second session of the Marxism meetings today, organized by the International Socialists in the Netherlands. This series of meetings is normally organized as an event where we come together to learn and discuss, but the current circumstances obviously call for online meetings instead. Yesterday, we kicked off with a meeting on how the COVID-19 crisis reveals the true nature of capitalism in all its contradictions. And in today's meeting, we'll be discussing the grand question of what socialism as an alternative to capitalism really is, and hopefully providing a succinct and clear introduction to the subject for those who might be new to activism or who have a general curiosity about the subject and would like to learn a little bit more. Now, in the upcoming weeks, there will be many more of these meetings, ranging from interviews and discussions like this one to reading groups and recordings. On the website of socialism.nu, you can find a full schedule of the activities that are planned over the upcoming weeks. Now, today with us, we have two amazing speakers who will be discussing some of the questions that one might have about socialism, like the different conceptions of socialism and the steps one might take on the way to socialist society, the need to organize, and also some of the common objections one might hear when the word socialism comes up in a political discussion. First of all, we have Abbie Head, a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in Bristol, who is heavily involved in climate action and student organizing. And with Abbie, we have Max Pogrzeba, member of the Groningen branch of the International Socialists. To everyone who's watching, please post your comments and your questions in the comments below. And at the end of the talk, I will have the chance to post your questions to the speakers. And also, if you enjoyed the talk and would like to talk about the subject some more, afterwards we will host an informal chat room in Zoom where we can socialize a bit and discuss anything else that comes up. If you're interested in joining this Zoom meeting, just let us know in the comments and we will send you an invitation. Now, without further ado, we can start off by having Abbie and Max introduce us to why this subject really matters. Why not capitalism? What's the reason we talk about these alternative conceptions of the organization of society, and what really is the need for this? Max, would you like to start?
I thought the plan was that Abbie starts.
Oh, I'm sorry. Abbie, would you like to start?
I'll start. Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you so much for having me today. I think it is a really important meeting, and we often hear people criticizing capitalism from all over the political spectrum, but to really critique it, we have to fully understand it, and then we can begin to fight it. And capitalism as a system is a political and economical system that's only really been around for about 400 years. And this system was born out of individualism. It prioritizes competition and private property. And since then, this small portion of human history, there has just been hardly any moments of peace. Only capitalism could breed the amount of bloody wars and nuclear wars that we've seen, the unnecessary oppression, institutional racism, and industrial fascism that have been some of the lowest points in human history. These are all symptoms of a system that rewards only the most exploitative and greedy and pushes them into power with no choice of the real common people. And the picture today of capitalism is as worrying as ever. We've got a global refugee crisis that's only being fueled by runaway climate change and masses of people going without even the simple right of food. 10% of the population of the earth is officially malnourished, whilst we're also producing enough food to feed the world 1.5 times over. So obviously the system as itself is broken. On top of all of this, currently we're experiencing coronavirus, which just reminds us that capitalism will continue to create life-threatening crises and is just completely not equipped to be able to deal with the consequences of those crises.
I also think that in answering the question as to why not capitalism or what the problem with the system is, I think one of the things with capitalism is that it's a system that's incredibly rich in contradictions, right? There are so many things that cause immense amounts of instability in the system and that are again and again show that it's unable to kind of guarantee a safe and good life for almost anyone, to be honest. If anything, a really small minority. And I think one of the points, one of the contradictions that Abbie has just also mentioned is she just said that we have basically enough food to feed the planet, yet there's people going hungry. And I think there's so many other kind of internal contradictions, like the fact that under capitalism, value is produced collectively by a lot of people, right? They're pushed together onto places of production, into factories. And at the same time, they're completely removed from what they're actually producing, often only producing tiny bits of a kind of bigger picture. But the value that they're actually creating is appropriated individually, and then kind of scraps are handed down to the mass of the people. So it contrasts poverty with immense wealth, right? Like, I think there's this story going around at the moment that Jeff Bezos is going to be the first trillionaire in history. At the same time, we hear stories of him basically not allowing unionizing at his warehouses of Amazon, of people living and working in really horrible conditions at these facilities. And I think these are just kind of some of the contradictions of the system. And it also shows that, like, there's an internal contradiction in how all kind of production of profits is based on actually taking something away from people, right? They only work for a portion of, sorry, I just got a notification, only of a portion of their wage, while that their wage is covered in a short amount of their actual workday. And after that, they continue working for their boss. And I think these kind of things create massive amounts of tensions. And yeah, I think that's part of the reason why I think capitalism is so unsustainable, even in its own right.
Right.
Yeah, well, just as well, like I think like understanding capitalism, and just an example of like kind of the crises that capitalism creates. It's like there's no better example than the climate crisis that we're living through right now. Like it's a really good, easy way of sort of understanding what capitalism is all about, especially because capitalism and the carbon industries, they grew up together and are heavily embedded in each other. And you know, you can see this relationship when we hear the really common stats, such as you know, the one that's been emerging recently about how 71% of all the emissions in the world are only are coming from 100 companies. That's 71% of all carbon emissions from 100 top companies. And then out of these industries, the number one contributor to carbon emissions is the US military, which, you know, is just a whole other section of capitalism, war and military. And, you know, even during this current crisis, where the lives of working people have been halted, you know, we're not in our cars, we're not going on holidays, the carbon emissions have only really gone down by 17%. So this makes us think, like, where are carbon emissions actually coming from? It's not from the lives of ordinary people. The ruling classes are the ones that are destroying the planet on a massive scale. But yet we see a lot of the conversations within the climate movement are very much individualist and to blame, trying to like change people's lifestyles. When actually working people really don't have any choice in their lifestyles or their diets, or, you know, where their food comes from or where their products that they buy come from. This is, you know, the organizings of the people at the top that choose these things. And we could try and, you know, like a lot of things about reforming capitalism to make it eco-friendly and like maybe appeal to the humanity of these ruling classes. But the very nature of capitalism just means that if you try and appeal to one billionaire oil guy to stop drilling, the fact is that someone else will just come in and do it instead. Unfortunately, capitalism doesn't have time or room for humanity. And so the only way that we can actually stop climate change is through mass action and central organizing. And that can only really be achieved through socialism.
If I can add something to this, if that's all right. I think also, like, the examples that you brought are really, really good. And I think that's also another one of these kind of contradictions in the system, right? The ideology of infinite growth that capitalism kind of really needs for it to develop and to grow. Like any kind of any stagnation in development and growth results in crisis in the system. So the point is to keep pushing, but infinite growth on a planet of finite resources, both human and natural, can only lead to disaster. And I think one of the kind of capitalist responses to this and the climate crisis is often that like, oh, the myth of overpopulation, right? And I think you rightfully mentioned already that I think I read the statistic the other day that like I think the bottom 50% of the world really, I mean, it's a fraction of the CO2 emissions that they're actually causing. So I think this argument of like, well, we have too many people on the planet or something like this is really false. And the problem that we actually have is one with distribution and who's producing, yeah, for whom.
Right. Yeah. So we have kind of now like this broad image where we have capitalism, which generates great inequalities and just inefficient distribution, inefficient aspects of production. So we have an idea of what kind of motivates this talk about socialism. But okay, the concept itself, it's still unsettled. So in the US, for example, we hear talk of socialism in the context of Bernie Sanders' previous presidential campaign. But we also think of the social movements of the 20th century and the works of Karl Marx when we talk about socialism. So could you perhaps clarify a bit what this term socialism involves and which distinctions in kind of different theories are generally made? And this time, would you like to start, Max?
Yes, so I would. I think the term socialism in itself is causing a lot of confusion. I think partially because of the fact that it has such a long-standing and rich history, and there's so many kind of different tendencies in it. I think like the thing that you're mentioning, for example, with the presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders, or also Jeremy Corbyn in the last years are kind of indication that socialism definitely is a topic. And I think that there keep being more and more polls kind of showing of like, oh, 60% of millennials prefer a socialist system or something like this. The truth is that we don't actually know what they really mean by that. I think specifically in the States, we often see this kind of idea that like, oh, Norway or Sweden or Denmark, those are socialist societies. And I think that's a very different conceptualization of socialism that we have as international socialists and as revolutionaries. I think, yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of different traditions, right? We have the kind of Marxist traditions, the revolutionary socialist tradition. There's the anarchist traditions that are also kind of under the umbrella term of socialism, social democracy, and all sorts of other projects. And I think one of the things that perhaps in the traditional understanding of it that unites all of them is this kind of opposition to capitalism, right? And the belief that a different world is possible. And that a world of solidarity is possible. And I think one of the things where we really, where there's a lot of differentiation is the kind of the question like how to get there. And I think there's of course the kind of the social democratic idea that basically we saw, for example, in the Corbynist in the project of Corbyn or Bernie Sanders, or many others, I think, that kind of reforms from above can, well, if you just elect the right president or the right candidate or the right party, that reforms from above can kind of hopefully change the system and make it more manageable, maybe over a slow period or like a slow kind of process over years can change capitalism to socialism. Although I think actually today most of the social democratic kind of perspectives have kind of scrapped the idea of socialism entirely, right? So they kind of propose a more manageable version of capitalism. So it kind of says that there's no need for revolution, that we can achieve everything through kind of electoral gains. And I think actually the projects of Corbyn and Sanders are kind of showing the pitfalls of this approach as well, right? Because have been immense resistance to these projects, and both in essence have failed. Due to not only kind of resistance on the far right or something like this, but even from among their own parties, from their own kind of establishments. And I think, you know, especially Sanders was running in a capitalist party, which made it really difficult for him to bypass the same party that he was running in. I think what keeps happening is that these kind of bourgeois parliaments or these kind of bourgeois systems are kind of giving a little bit of the illusion that, well, you have a little bit of a say, but when it comes to actually changing it, they will be met with really harsh limitations. And if people actually get to power, what we see often is that there will be even military interventions happening. I think this is something that we keep seeing in South America, where democratically elected governments are basically overthrown by right-wing military coups to defeat these kind of left-wing progressive projects. And I think there were even comments made by people in the army about that something similar would happen if Corbyn would ever be elected. I think this was a news story a couple of years ago. Of course, we don't know if that would have actually happened, but I think even the fact that there is this kind of that stands in the room, it speaks for itself. I think another tradition is the anarchist tradition. And I think that's something that where we perhaps have the same goals, but again, we disagree quite heavily on how to achieve them. The anarchists, at least the left-wing anarchists, often also stand in a revolutionary tradition. They also have socialist understandings, and I understand the need for solidarity. But I think we disagree with them on the kind of principle of organization and the kind of like how to actually move beyond how to actually manifest a revolution, how to actually achieve socialism in the long term. And I think there's a question on a disagreement on authority as well, right? So there's this disagreement of all authority in the anarchist tradition, whereas I think in our Marxist tradition we say a little bit more, well, a revolution, for example, is a really authoritarian process where one class, the majority of people are basically pushing back against the minority, the ruling class. And I think we also disagree on ways of organizing. I think in the Marxist tradition that we stand in, we think that organizing in revolutionary organizations like parties is really important because it gives us structure, it gives us the ability to work together, to not having to keep reinventing the wheel, that we have a kind of tradition that we can look back on, and that we also have knowledge that we can look back on, and knowledge of successes, but also of failures that we can learn from in our own organizations. And we also don't think that after revolution the state can be done away with in 24 hours, but we think that most likely there will be counter-revolution, and that perhaps the state and some structures like that need to be retained in order to defend the revolution. I think it's a super big topic. I could talk about it for a really long time, but I think we should probably move on. And I think Abbie wanted to talk a little bit about the experience of Stalinism in the USSR and how we relate to that.
Yeah, thank you, Max. And I think you did such a great job of explaining the unfortunate truth that socialism can't be, won overnight, and you can't just get socialism from just like a few individuals pulling it. You need the whole of the class working in their own interests together, and it's a gradual process to kind of get rid of these years of unequal hierarchies. And obviously, if we're going to be talking about the different kinds of socialisms, we do need to confront the one of the most famous famous kind of systems that goes under the name, at least, of socialism in history, which is the USSR. And socialism has a very rich history, and like some of the resistance against capitalism has made huge wins. And one of the most inspirational examples of these wins was the Russian Revolution in 1917, where workers successfully organized to overthrow the ruling class and create a real workers' state. And a lot of us look back at this and are inspired by it. But unfortunately, whilst the working class made huge progress in that time, we saw women's rights and abortions, or like instantly winning abortions, and I'm just thinking from the top of my head now, just the ones that I remember, it was like homosexuality was legalized, just everything became a lot better during this period. But the pressures of global capitalism and world war obviously got to this, and a counter-revolution took place under Stalin, who took the success of the Bolsheviks and created a system under the name of capitalism that we look back at and call, instead of communism or socialism, we call it state capitalism, which still exploited workers and still pursued imperialism, just like every other capitalist powerhouse at that time. But instead of like in the West, how we experience it, where exploitation comes from individual capitalists that make the ruling class, this exploitation was coming from the state instead. But the exploitation is still there. Workers were not running society, and real socialism is a system that is run by workers. It has full democracy, and people have autonomy over their own lives and work. And when we look at the USSR, that wasn't the situation, and therefore it wasn't socialism.
Max, so we kind of are getting some views of kinds of socialism that might have not worked or that do not completely adhere to at least the international socialist view. Could you explain a little bit more about what we stand for as revolutionary socialists?
Yes, definitely. I think so. There's all of these kind of terms like a democratic socialism or authoritarian socialism, reformist or revolutionary, and I think we're definitely we're a group that is dedicated to a democratic system and to revolution, right? So we think that these things can be combined and that they are in fact necessary to, like, a revolutionary socialist society is necessary to really create a democratic world and a democratic system. I think there's this conceptualization of, well, Marx said this thing about socialism basically being the movement for the self-emancipation of the working class, and I think that's one of the really central kind of features in where we stand ideologically, right? That it's not something that socialism cannot be achieved by a small minority of people who do the revolution for someone, or who tell the masses what to do, or who kind of replace that, or it cannot be put on from above, but that basically the working class need to struggle for their own emancipation, in their own rights. I'm kind of repeating myself. I'm sorry. I think there's this essay by an American socialist called Hal Draper, The True Source of Socialism, and he kind of says that the heart of socialism from below is the view that socialism can be realized only through the self-emancipation of the activated masses in motion, reaching out for freedom with their own hands, mobilized from below in the struggle to make change, to take charge of their own destiny as actors and not merely subjects of the stage of history. And I think this is really one of the kind of central ideas that we have, right? So I think we live in a system where working class people are kind of alienated, right? They feel like they're not powerful, and that is because we don't live in a democratic world. I think people realize that giving a little like cross every 4 years on a ballot is not actually a democratic experience. If we go to work, we have no democracy. If we go to school, we have no democracy. If we go to uni, we have no democracy. We basically have no democratic experiences anywhere. And I think our job as revolutionary socialists of the working class is to show and tell people that they can stand up and that they can, they can change the world and that they can take charge of their lives. And I think, in a sense, that's the tradition that we stand in.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry. No, I was just thinking about what you were saying. And yeah, I think you're right in saying like the strategies that we go through, like it's about this unison. But unfortunately, right now, the world that we live in, the class of it isn't working in complete unison. And as socialists, as revolutionary socialists, during these times, what we push for as much as possible is the class working together. So a common strategy that we have is the United Front, which is something that is very much a technique pioneered by one of the famous Bolsheviks, Leon Trotsky, and it's this idea that getting groups of working people together from all different sections of the class to collaborate and work together to pursue a common interest. Then hopefully through that, struggling together, radicalizing with each other and learning with each other. One of the most successful examples of this, at least in the UK, but I'm pretty sure globally, is the class working against the rise in racism and fascism. Obviously, the working class all have invested interests in pushing back the rise of racism and fascism. A defeat for one area of the class is a defeat for all of us. And we've had some great movements in the UK, one of the most famous being the Anti-Nazi League, where, you know, in the 70s and 80s, we saw huge rises in like very racist regimes such as the National Front, but the Anti-Nazi League almost created a cultural revolution within the working class that poured hundreds of thousands of people out to the street. And at concerts and stuff, we had Rock Against Racism, where we had huge names coming out to this sort of Rock Against Racism and say it's like standing up to racism and basically making it not cool to be racist. But it's a lot more complicated than that, and a lot more, you know, is a lot more than that. But that's Unite Front really working in the benefit of the working class, and hopefully with that empowering us and pulling us further. However, you know, during this, we have to be careful to not sort of, there's a difference between a united front and a popular front, and you know, we have to be careful as socialists to make sure that the movements that we involve ourselves in are the movements that are in favor of the working class. And you know, the different classes have different interests, and we start collaborating with those that do not have the same interests as the class, they can overtake and actually disintegrate a movement. The climate, bringing it back to climate change, because it's such an all-encompassing issue right now, but the climate movement is a really good example of a united front. I know in Bristol we have our own, like in the universities and in the city, we have our own united fronts against climate change, where we work together, such as, you know, we have Extinction Rebellion groups, labour groups, obviously socialist groups, all coming together with the common goal of fighting climate change. But if you, like with climate change, obviously there are some people that have different interests in the strategies that we have to change climate change, such as, you know, the liberal elite or the ruling classes. And once they start to come in, they can start, you know, taking over the narratives and ruining that. So, you know, like one of the main points of the United Front is that it is the class. It's not, you know, that it's the class coming together, and that's the most important part. Yeah.
Right, no, that's very clear. Thank you. Did you want to add something, Max?
Yes, I mean, I suppose Abbie was talking about the United Front, and I think that's kind of the question on, well, what's our role in kind of working together with other groups, right? And who are we in this kind of bigger piece? And I think that's kind of the question on, like, how do we organize a socialist movement, and what's our conception of this? And I think it might make things clear. I think, like, the idea that we have on how to organize a socialist movement, and how to kind of relate to people, and how to build a movement that's strong enough to participate in revolution and really kind of have a say and give a direction, is this idea that we have called vanguardism, right? That we kind of build a revolutionary party that is made out of class conscious people and class conscious elements in the working class. Because we believe that revolutions are not made, they happen, and revolutionary movements often spring about really spontaneously, possibly even at moments where none of us are expecting this. However, successful revolutions are not something that are, like, inevitable or necessarily happen every time. I think even in the last 10 years or so, we have seen a lot of revolutionary movements internationally that really didn't necessarily fundamentally change society, right? So our idea is that we organize those people in society that are already class conscious, or that are really willing to learn, that want to struggle, or that are already standing in the struggle, that are organized, that have a high degree of a kind of understanding that things need to change and that they can be changed, right? Because Abbie has already said that there's people with contrary interests, and I think there's also people with kind of false consciousness, right, in the working class, who maybe say, well, yes, there are problems, but it's the fault of the immigrants, or that really kind of, through that, support really capitalist parties and projects. And I think it's not just about numbers, especially in the beginning of organizing kind of revolutionary movement or socialist movement, but to kind of bring about the people that are dedicated, right, and that are willing, that have the kind of experience that we need. And it's not about saying that we're better than the others, and like detaching us from the rest of the population of the working class, but it's about intervening consciously together with people that have experience, right, and that reject racism, that reject sexism, that reject transphobia, and that reject like a hate towards the working class and policies that hurt the working class. So we kind of think that if you're an individual, you can do a couple of things, but you really will not be able to bring about systemic change. But if you have a group of organized people, let's say in the Netherlands, thousands, hundreds or thousands of people, active members of a revolutionary organization who come together and who have a line of march that they decided on together, that say, in the next year, this will be our project, those will be our perspectives. Like we can have a real political impact in the Netherlands, in and activist coalitions, in universities, and trade unions will be able to have a real say. And I think that's a little bit like the second part of the way that we organize this idea of democratic centralism, that within our party or within our group, there's freedom in discussion, but then after that, unity in action, right? That we talk about what's the plan, we draw from all of our experience, from all of our thoughts, but then we act together rather than saying, I think that's the thing in a lot of kind of bourgeois party congresses that we see, there's all of this talk about what we're going to do, and then everybody goes their own kind of ways, and also in social democratic parties. Whereas I think in our point, it's a bit more, if we decide it together, we do it together, and we see if it works. And if it doesn't work, then we'll change our course of action the next year or the next time around whenever it's necessary. So there's a great division of tasks, but a kind of high centralization of information and of kind uh, of exchange of different branches in the country, and also internationally. I mean, we're part of an international network of revolutionary organizations that the SWP that Abbie is a part of is also part of, and I think we have sections in around 30 countries that all come together and communicate about what's going on in the country and what we can learn from each other. I think that's a really big advantage compared to kind of loose activist networks only that are really not in kind of global networks or in international networks.
And if you don't mind me just coming in on that, yeah, I thought that, yeah, you said it really well, that the points of the party is to really not alienate ourselves from the working struggle, but actually to be as much as part of it and to push it as to elevate it as much as possible. And you do see this sometimes on the left, or just misreadings of kind of like Marxist ideology, that the only thing that we care about is class and economic exploitation. But actually, it it like to alienate yourself. I think it's actually a quote from Leon Trotsky that says that a group that doesn't relate to struggle is just a propaganda machine and not an organization of mass struggle. And so if we alienate ourselves from struggles such as struggles against racism, sexism, homophobia, sadly there's a lot of struggles right now, but if we alienate ourselves from those things, then we're not part of the wider struggle. And we do think of oppression, like all the things that I just mentioned, as to be rooted from capitalism. Obviously, we're against, we are always on the side of the oppressed, because I think oppression is the strongest and most worst tool of capitalism. As socialists, we oppose all things of capitalism. But we can still make our gains during the period of capitalism. We can reform under capitalism. It doesn't make us reformists by any means, but reforming under capitalism, it can only benefit workers. The elevation of women throughout the last 100 years has done amazing things for the class, and can only do amazing things for the class, elevating all of the working class and raising the confidence and making gains in all sections is of the utmost importance of the struggle.
Yeah, I think I want to add something to that as well, which is adding on top of each other, but I think that's great. I think there's this idea that kind of keeps being brought up, and unfortunately also some Marxist or kind of communist groups, that the all of these things are kind of distractions. That if we talk about racism, that's a distraction. If we talk about sexism, that's a distraction. And the only thing that's necessary is the class struggle, which is what Abbie just said as well. And I think these kind of points. Just they have this idea that the working class is somehow just like white and male or something like this, which is completely not true. Like, I think we have the strongest, biggest working class that we ever had, with billions of people on the planet. The majority of those are not white, and I think possibly the majority, well, at least half of them are not men. So this idea that there's this really like kind of narrow idea of what the working class is and who we need to be struggling for is it's really hard for me to understand. And I think if you want to activate people and show them that there's a movement that fights against the oppression, well, fights against oppression, you cannot just say, well, we'll deal with that, once we've dealt with capitalism, or that we'll just do it automatically. But we need to already stand together with these people now, in the here and now, and be tribunes of the people. I think that's another quote that we can throw in. I think Lenin said that we need to be tribunes of the people and kind of head on, like confront oppression wherever it exists. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a lot of many really great things that you said. And just to sum up a little bit, we started from the question of, okay, what does socialism really mean? And we've kind of set revolutionary socialism apart from anarchism, from state capitalism, and from social democracy, as being kind of an organization of society where democracy pervades all aspects of life, and there's an increased autonomy of the worker and increased equality among all people. But in talking about this now at the end, we've gotten also to talk about kind of the path towards socialism. So what does it kind of take? Which steps are needed to be taken to get there? And we've talked about kind of this element of vanguardism in the revolutionary socialist movement, but also how the United Front kind of plays a big role in keeping the movement sensitive to the struggles of the working class that are very broad, related to many kinds of identities. So this kind of general outline has come into view. At first, I'd like to actually ask all the viewers to please feel free to post your comments and your questions, because at the end, I'll be able to post them to the speakers, and we will be able to talk a little bit more about the things that interest you or that you might be wondering about. But so now that we kind of have an idea of what we are talking about when we talk about socialism, I would like to kind of ask you about your thoughts on the kinds of things that would come up when I would talk to family members or, the person next to me at a bar, a time long past, obviously. There are a couple of objections that usually come up, and they usually revolve around the conception of some kind of conception of human nature that supposedly is not compatible with the way that socialist society would be organized. So, for example, it wouldn't account for the inherent laziness of people, or that socialist society would abolish the progress that comes from competition in the market. And I just wanted to ask you, what would you say against these kinds of objections?
Who's going first on this one, me?
Yes, you.
Yes,
Go
me.
ahead.
Yeah, no, I think like what you just said, one of the really one of the most famous ones that you hear all the time commonly is the kind of idea about like human nature. So the kind of thing that people are competitive, greedy, the things that we're lazy, the things that we're just part of the human, like the animal kingdom. There's hierarchies in different animal kingdoms. You have that kind of like alpha, like sorry, alpha wolf thing, or like the lobster stuff where you have like the need for authority. And so like just like, okay, the first one, the kind of the greedy one. And during capitalism, unfortunately, the ideas of the ruling class trickle down, and we begin to believe the realities that the ruling class live in. Whilst they may experience like that, maybe their human experience is that the people around them are competitive, greedy, and selfish. Actually, the experiences of working people and our relationships constantly prove that to be wrong. I mean, the very basic life of the working person is working long, hard hours and never really getting anything more than just food on the table and a roof over their head for the rest of their lives. Is that greedy? I don't really think so. We have a lot of workers, a lot of people working that just take care of vulnerable people and the sick and the elderly. Like that's a huge part of the working force. And like why would people do that for such a little amount of money unless people really cared about each other? And even right now, we've seen it with the corona crisis. A lot. I'm sure that it's the same around Europe. And our government has failed us massively on caring for our communities. So you've really seen the class sort of flourishing in organizing these kind of grassroots like action groups to make sure that the most vulnerable get what they need, and that's just our real interest coming into play, because humans at the end of the day are we're only so successful because of our collaboration and our relationships. That is what has propelled us throughout history. It's only this new idea that we're selfish in the first place. We've always collaborated with each other, and like I said before, capitalism is very new, and you have these primitive communist tribes, like, beyond that, you've had matriarchal tribes. You've had so many different kinds of organizations of communities under different kind of power structures, that we really need to question any kind of like concept of what human nature is and what the natural order is, whether it comes to gender, race, sexuality, everything. We really can't know anything for sure as the actual natural order. And I think you actually see this a lot out the right wing. And I think it's no coincidence that the right wing are always comparing us to animals, because they very much love the idea that everything is how it is and nothing can be changed, because they're benefiting out of this system. They want us to think that there are such things as natural hierarchies and alphas, and you are born into a lifestyle and a body that you cannot change that, because they don't want you to think that you can. And they don't want to believe that it can change, because they want to feel comfortable in the lives that they live, and they want to feel comfortable in being the highest point of society. And I just want to also finish on this kind of laziness part. Marx says it all the time, and it is very much true that labor is one of the most important parts of human consciousness. It's very connected to our humanity. We naturally are attracted to labor, whether it's creative labor or manual labor. Like, it's just a very human experience. But that maybe we struggle with labor under capitalism because it's menial, alienated labor that means nothing to us, that we reap no benefits from, that is never changing, the same thing over and over again with no benefits and no variation, and we have to do it for 8 hours a day. It's like, I'm pretty sure that I've had sort of studies that say that we could live very comfortably as a society on 3-hour work days. We could provide the things that we need to survive and live very comfortably on 3-hour work days. That extra five hours that we're living under now is the surplus that benefits the ruling classes. Once we get rid of these unnecessary industries, this unnecessary use of time and materials, we're opened up to so much more time for, like, building our lives and enjoying our lives and our relationships and like working, like being a human. So yeah, maybe we are a little bit repulsed by labor, but that's because the labor that we're doing is not benefiting us. It's benefiting 1% of the population that really don't deserve all of our times in our lives. So yeah, we're not lazy, but capitalism definitely strips away a lot of joy in work, at least.
That was really clear, Abbie. Thank you. Next time I encounter one of those people at the bar, I will know exactly what to tell them. Now, Max, another point that we keep hearing is that socialism supposedly isn't democratic. For example, because it rejects parliamentary democracy as we know it, or at least has very little faith in it. And what would you respond to this concern that people bring up?
I think, to answer that question, I think especially the point about kind of parliamentarism, I think I addressed this earlier a little bit already, but I think I repeat it for the sake of clarity. I think there's this like idea that we kind of get told from the moment that we kind of enter kind of political consciousness in one way or another, that democracy is only kind of the bourgeois standard that we know, right? The idea that every 4 years you can vote for a representative of the capitalist class that supposedly speaks for our interests, but then and then we kind of give up all autonomy for a couple of years. And yes, there's one way or another perhaps to change something in between if the situation is really dire, but that's the kind of the general conception of democracy. But as I said earlier, we have a complete lack of democracy in workplaces, even in legal aspects. Like, there's always this example of like, oh, you think there's kind of like legal equality, try making lawsuit against the Coca-Cola company or something like this, I think. And very quickly these ideas of even kind of legal democracy or equality are falling apart completely. And I think if we kind of look to the past, we see things that inspire us for different kinds of democracy, right? We see that especially in the 18th and 19th century, these projects called like workers' councils, or in Russian Soviets, kind of sprung up and were developed, and they didn't really come out from people having an idea and telling workers, well, this is what you have to do. But these are kind of processes and institutions that came up quite organically. For example, in Russia, and they had actually massive amounts of power over society, and they were taking a lot of responsibilities that the government couldn't take, or where people thought that the government wasn't doing it right. And those were assemblies of working people, and of peasants in the case of Russia, who came together, who said, we're going to manage the communities that we live in by our own standards, by our own beliefs. And there's many different ways in which, and the details and how they were organized. But I think there was a whole different democratic culture. And the same in situations where we saw historically where workers were taking over factories or the places of production, where they came together and said, okay, all of this profit business aside, what do we actually want to produce, and how do we actually want to produce it? And what does actually need to be produced, right, on a national scale? Like, what are the things that society needs us to do, and how can we participate in this? And I think these are completely different conceptions of democracy, that we are told that, those are the only ideas, or the only valid kind of democracies. I think one of the examples that the socialist movement, the Marxist tradition, keeps coming back to is this idea, or this example of the Paris Commune from 1871, which is often kind of seen as the first working class revolution ever, or at least successful in one way or another. Unfortunately, not successful for too long. But this is kind of a moment where the people of Paris said, fuck it, we're going to take over the city, we're going to chase out the ruling class, and we're going to make our own society the way that we want to see it. And what you saw is that there were like neighborhood committees being formed of people really reorganizing the way that that the districts and blocks were run, that their workplaces were run, that the newspapers were run. There was an explosion of democracy and of art and of freedom, much similar to the early years of the Soviet Union, or of Russia after the revolution. And again, a whole different conceptualization of democracy. So I think these are kind of examples that you can actually find in many revolutionary situations all over the world, where people actually have this show a really deep understanding of democracy, and that they need to be the people that the people themselves need to make it, and rather than just kind of depending on someone else to do it. But of course, in a post-revolutionary society, I think this idea of the politician will also wither away. It will kind of disappear, because people will be way more involved in democratic processes on a day-to-day basis. And perhaps there will be systems of some kind of representative democracy, or some kind of delegates or something like this, because you cannot um, do all, you cannot travel to Amsterdam or to a bigger city or something like this to make kind of more broader geographical decisions. But then I think, for example, in Paris, we saw that in the Paris Commune that the elected representatives were also subject to recall at any moment. So if people were not happy with what they were doing, they could be recalled at any time. And I think it's a much more direct and fast responsive system of democracy than what we're used to. And I think another part of this whole question is, again, the idea of Stalinism, or this kind of like, well, we started off with this democratic project in Russia, but then it kind of degenerated into something that we really don't like. And I think there's much other examples for that. Some where I think, really need to distance ourselves really very clearly from, and some where we say, well, it has a lot of limitations. And I think, as for example, the idea of or the process of how democracy was lost in Russia, I think there's specific conditions where that led to this, right? The revolution was isolated. I think the revolutionaries in 1917 were very aware of the fact that if they wanted the revolution to succeed, it needed to be international. It can't just be an isolated little socialist island in the sea of capitalist aggressors who are not actually acting with the same interest that the socialist system would. However, the revolutionary movements in many other European countries, and globally actually, that were kind of came after and that were inspired by the Russian Revolution, were often betrayed or destroyed in Germany, really famously by the Social Democratic Party. But there was also really like a lack of a clear revolutionary party with a kind of history and tradition and an analysis of what needs to be done in Germany. But anyways, the revolution was isolated, and then there was a civil war, and I think those were kind of the conditions that brought about a degeneration of a really genuinely democratic way of conceptualizing society and of making society into this kind of more bureaucratic elite system that we then later knew as the Soviet Union, specifically after the death of Lenin. Yeah, and I think if I can add one more point, I think if in, for example, things like the Cuban Revolution, we also see that often or the Chinese Revolution as well. It's focused on kind of paramilitary groups taking over the ruling layers of society, right? Or kind of fighting a war against the old regime. And I think while there's certainly the likelihood that there will need to be a need for kind of militant struggle or like armed struggle or something in a revolution, I think that's not our focus. And I think these examples also show that in a way these processes were not based on workplace democracy or on workers' autonomy, but that they were again kind of minority projects that were telling like this is the way to go forward, right? So I think there needs to be some kind of critical evaluation of these projects and see what we can learn from them, but also what we reject in our own positions and what we think is important to do instead.
Thank you, Max. That was very clear, very informative. I love the historical examples that you gave. But we're nearing the end of the time for the talk right now, and we still have some questions from the viewers to discuss. So to wrap this all up, I wanted to ask you if you could both explain to us why should people join the socialist movement, and in particular, an organization like the International Socialists?
I'll go first, and I haven't actually. I didn't really write any notes for this one because I thought that maybe I'd be able to do it off the top of my head, because it's definitely something that I feel obviously quite passionate in, and I think many people that join a socialist organisation will end up feeling passionate in. It's kind of inevitable. I'm sure a lot of people watching would relate if they had, because you know, obviously we talk about the politics and how important it is on a personal basis. It's important for you, like if you're interested in these ideas, there's no better organization to place yourself within except for a socialist one. You know, especially if you come from a background of like you know, not being so well educated, the position of the role of the organization is to propel, to empower each individual worker and each individual socialist to a point where they can, you know, go out into their workplaces and organize themselves. Like that's the interest of the organization. But you know, that's why like right now, for example, the Socialist Worker Party, we are operating a lot of organization within the workers to fight back against the mistakes of the state in dealing with corona. But during this process, we're also, you know, having book clubs. You know, we talk to each other like 3 times a week about current politics and really give a socialist analysis of this. We, you know, it's like another form of radical education that you deserve, that you don't really get for free from anywhere else. And you don't really, there's not really many other places where you can come together with people of all different skills and experiences and ages, you know, where your main interest is elevating each other. There's not really many other places you can go that can provide that for free. So, I mean, there's obviously the personal interest, but on a political note, like if you feel overwhelmed by what capitalism is doing to the world, there's really no other position that you can be in than be on the side of the radical left. You know, we've had some great things like Greta Thunberg, who came to Bristol recently, who galvanized like 30,000 people or something. Maybe that's not right. Maybe that is right. I think it's 30,000 people. And like with that, you know, you're able to experience like all sides of the struggle, you know, from the small things like, you know, like mental health strikes in the university to the huge things like Greta Thunberg marches, where you see history being made in front of your eyes. Like there's no way that you can be part of that and be on the right side of history with that unless you join a socialist organisation such as International Socialists or the SWP?
That was so good. I love it. um, I don't even know what to add. I think that was really great. I think I can add a couple of things maybe from my personal experience. I am a member in a feminist organization in Groningen and have done lots of kind of movement building, and I think that's all really important and really great. But I also agree with Abbie that the kind of like the place where you really kind of get educated about the kind of Marxist understandings of the world and how to really kind of break out of the systems that we are taught to believe, and also really be given strategies for kind of long-term projects. That's something that I think I really learned by becoming a member of the IS. And that's why I really want to encourage other people to become a member of the International Socialists as well. I think that it's a group that, especially in the Netherlands, I think where the left is very weak, especially the parliamentary left. That's what I'm saying. That's what I mean. It's kind of actually frustrating and alienating a lot of people, right? Like there's a lot of people that are frustrated with the project of the SP, which is supposed to be the Socialist Party, but they don't really speak on a lot of the kind of issues of race and gender and sexism, all of these kind of things, because they say, again, it divides the working class. And then you have, for example, the Green Left Party, but they're economically a really capitalist party. So in a way, like I understand that people are super alienated, and I think us as the International Socialists, we kind of pull these kind of aspects and these kind of traditions together a little bit, right? And we say, well, actually, the struggle of all of these movements is important, and we need to participate in them. We need to push for them to have revolutionary understandings of the world, and at the same time, also really standing for a socialist kind of economic perspective that we have. And I think by joining an organization like the International Socialists, there's space for so many things to do, right? We have a paper. We also have reading groups. We do monthly meetings that are public. We have a festival every year. Obviously, we have a conference that is internal for people to kind of discuss which way we should go. But I think there's also just like so much space for so many different kinds of skills. So if somebody wants to participate in the paper, there's space for that. If you want to design posters, there's space for that. If you're really good on talking to people and approaching them, there's space for that. If you just want to like support the organization in terms of structures internally, there's space for that. So I think I really want to encourage you to contemplate or to think about becoming a member of the International Socialists if you're in the Netherlands, or of the Socialist Workers' Party, indeed, if you're in the UK. And I think we can do a lot of great things together.
I can only underwrite all the things that you've said from my personal experience also. I joined not too long ago with the IS in Groningen too. And it really helped me to kind of lift my personal struggles to a more communal level, to be able to talk about them with more like-minded people, understand them, and even think about real action that we can do, real things to help people, and to think about a different future. And yeah, to me, I would, if you're thinking about it, I can just say what Max said. It's something to consider if that's your situation. And I guess with that, we've come to the end of the discussion part, and now I would like to propose to you some of the questions that have been posed in the chat. And I'm going to start, and I'm going to kind of take two questions together because I think they really complement each other. Because the first question was a really good question. What would 21st century socialism look like in practical terms? Now, we knew that one was coming. But I wanted to add the second one to it to kind of give a little bit more direction to the question, namely the question, who is going to produce my clothes, my bread, and my house if we get rid of capitalism?
Do you mind if I come in first on this one, Max?
Please.
I won't go fully into it.
No, just do what you think.
I think it's a great question that really does kind of make us like really inspire, like make us have to confront the kind of the concepts of automation, and this, it's like we're 21st century Marxists, and like we consider automation highly, and like it's not like we're void from understanding that we're going through a technological revolution like more and more every decade. And really both these questions kind of reflect like how would we live now? And I think specifically who's going to produce my bread and my house, like my clothes and stuff, like and I'm not saying that all things are going to be produced by machines, but at the end of the day, we have such amazing advancements. But these advancements are only being made to benefit capitalism. If we had a complete revolutionary upheaval of where the directions and benefits of scientific and technological creation is going, if that makes sense, if that sentence makes sense, if we change the direction of profit and money making and the minds, we have so many smart people that are wasted in creating, like in continuing capitalism. We get those people, and we could just we can even begin to believe the medical and technological advancements we can make if we actually started pouring these energies and this time and these resources into actually fixing the world and fixing people and making lives nicer for each other. So I think, you know, there's no shame in producing clothes or bread. We're not saying that bakers and sewers, I can't think of the word for it right now. We're not saying that these things should die, but we do think that, you know, the horrible parts of life, the ones that are very the very minorities of society have to be pushed into doing just for food on the table. We can work to make sure that those kind of horrible parts of life are either equally shared out, so we have shared responsibility for those things, or we can try and like spend time on creating technologies to do that stuff for us.
I think I can only agree. I think the point about automation is really important. And in capitalism, if robots take over, if robots are kind of built in a factory for cars or something, that's a negative. That's a negative thing in capitalism, right? But in socialism, I think that's a huge advancement. And like again, this idea that we live in this kind of society where actually we produce more than we need already, and it just needs to be distributed in a different way is really important. And the reduction of working hours, again, I think I agree with Abbie that like there will not suddenly be no more like people working in the textile industry or who make bread or something like this. But I think there can be massive reduction of working hours, and also I think the way that things are produced will be different, right? In capitalism, we live in a system where profit is really important, so often things are produced to fail and to break. And there's in the industry interest is to change the trend of what's needed and what's necessary I mean 4 times a year, right, with every season basically. And I think in a socialist society where we wouldn't have this profit motive anymore, things wouldn't be produced to break, and I think there would be a whole different conceptualization on or a whole different reality on what things we need. And this is not to say that we will only produce the bare the necessities, right? That we will produce obviously things that people want and that make people enjoy life. But I think there can be completely different possibilities, and I think that's one of the things that in our tradition we often kind of say, well, we don't want to like indulge in utopias. We're not utopian socialists. We stand on more scientific basis, but at the same time, I think there are some things that we can easily conceptualize, like yes, there will be a reduction in working hours, and yes, production will be different because it will not be according to capitalist standards anymore. And to come back, I mean, I don't know if that was the intention of the question on like what the 21st century socialism would look like, but I think every kind of generation of socialists has to also see what the movement has to look like. And I think again, to reconnect to what we said earlier, like 21st century socialism needs to be queer positive, feminist, needs to be anti-racist, against ableism and transphobia, and all of these things, right? It needs to encompass broad structures of understanding oppression. And I think it has, at least in tendencies and parts, for a long time already, but I think now more than ever, we need to really push this to the fore, like to be a central part of our struggle.
I'm sorry, can I come back again, Emma?
Yes,
yeah, you said it so well, Max. You definitely, about what it really means to be socialist in the 21st century is to be all encompassing. And when you were talking also about like production and stuff, and you were talking a little bit about how things are made to break, etc., and it just kind of like made me start thinking about fashion. And like I'm a fashion student as well, so like I get a little bit enthusiastic about these things because it's a perfect example of the complete faults of capitalism. Like you were sort of talking about fashion, about like how we create new seasons like 4 times a year. Well, actually, the unfortunate truth about capitalism, about fashion under like late capitalism and neoliberal sort of like capitalism, means that actually a lot of the fast fashion shops, they create new collections every week, like, and they will keep on going, and they will keep on instigating this idea of identity and like, you know, as much as they can sell you for the cheapest and the most harmful ways of like producing products and stuff. And like, you know, the fashion industry in itself, like, it is the second biggest polluter in the planet because of that. And it just, that's also another thing about like what will socialism look like in the 21st century, and kind of like all of the stuff that we were talking about in automation. We have to kind of think about climate change with that, because like I was saying before, and I just felt like I had to mention it, because, you know, you hear about these fantastic ideas that scientists and, you know, politicians have about like Green New Deals and 1 million climate jobs, and like the amazing things that we could do to save our planet in the next, like, what is it, 11 years that we have until it's non-reversible. Like, people have a plan for this. The only thing that's in the way of saving the planet and is money. It's money and profit, and, you know, who's benefiting from this? You know, why would we build like all of the wind turbines if it doesn't create profit? Well, that wouldn't be an issue under socialism. It's a capitalist project. It's a capitalist problem that socialism can just fix. Sorry for getting a bit excited then, but that, you know, it's definitely worth mentioning the climate change. The climate, like, we will see a revolution in the way that we fuel our whole world if we just stopped caring about money and started caring about the planet.
Yeah, thanks. That's I love the enthusiasm and the passion there. And I just wanted to kind of come back to something that you just touched on, but Max also mentioned about kind of like, yeah, we don't want to be utopian socialists, right? We don't want to propose a vision of society which is in all its aspects beautiful, without conflict, without hunger, without anything. Like, yes, there's a level of that we need to avoid, because it's realistically a way towards a world which is a utopia. It's the reason why it's called a utopia. So I just want to mention that one part that's related to that in my mind is kind of that, like, the capitalist ideology is really centered around the thought that there is no alternative, that capitalism is the only way to organize things. And I think that when you start thinking about the way capitalism is organized more in a way where, well, perhaps things could be different, then you realize that the suffering and the pain that is created in a system that might seem just a fact of life really doesn't have to be that way. And that's not a utopian thing, but that's simply an effect of the way that things are organized right now. And the reason why that's not a utopian thought, of course, is, as we've already mentioned, we have the capacity to produce enough food for everyone, and we have the capacity to have more green modes of production. But there's something that's keeping us from doing that, and I think, Abbie, you did a really great job of explaining that. So then there was another really great question, which I think you will have a nice time answering. And it goes, should I understand socialist movements to operate first and foremost locally, or do they have international ambitions? I'm asking this also because there are countries who are just now beginning to benefit from capitalism and who did not ask for this economic system in the first place.
Which economic system in the first place? The socialist system or the capitalist system?
The capitalist one,
right?
I think.
Abbie, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe just like a passing comment, and like I'm just thinking from the top of my head now, like you know, the way that Marx would write about capitalism is it's the perfect kind of system to create the same grounds in which to overthrow it. So creating organized workplaces and a bigger working force also creates the exact conditions in which capitalism can be overthrown. So yes, it's true that capitalism, as like 21st century industrial capitalism, is spreading itself all across the world. The only kind of positive way that we can look at that is like the working class is growing, you know, and so more and more workers can also become united. And we've seen from the past that when and it's happened so many times, that when with one success, it's a domino effect entirely. You know that so where the wider the working class and the more global the working class, hopefully the more successful of a revolution. And definitely as both of our organizations' traditions, we're international socialists, and we don't view the struggle as just in our own cities or even in our own countries. It's the only way that socialism can sustain itself is through all the workers in the world uniting. So yeah, that's my response to that question.
Mm.
I fully agree. I think it's really correct what Abbie said about the working class growing, and that's in a way kind of a silver lining in this kind of horrible development at the same time. And I think this is kind of the to clarify what we mean if we say that like capitalism creates its own gravediggers. It's that the working people actually have the ability to hit the system where it hurts the most, right? If they go on strike and if they say, actually, we will not participate in this anymore, capitalism can crash. Like the profits will fall. Like, you know, the people that actually own the factories can't operate them themselves, right? That's the thing, that workers are operating everything in society. Everything that we see is built by working people. And I think that's where the big potential lies. And as for the question of an international revolution or an international network, I think it's super important. I think that this idea of international revolution is so important because the revolution cannot be isolated. It's weak that way, right? Also, there's an interest of neighboring countries to say, actually, our buddies over there, the bourgeoisie from that other country, the ruling class from that other country, they're being overthrown. No, actually, we need to go in. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Russia, right? I think 9 or 10 imperialist armies invaded Russia right after the revolution. So the First World War was over, and then they were like, oh, let's just go over there and kind of beat the crap out of these people who said we're actually going to change society and we're going to run it in a different way. And I think one of the ways in which it had such devastating effects, even if the Russian working class won in that struggle in a way, was because there was no international networks that could really support and defend them as well, right? If really Russia was a really like an agricultural and feudal society in many ways at the beginning of the revolution, Germany, for example, more or less right next door, was a really like an industrial society at this point already. So they have entirely different capacities of support. And I think that's one of the reasons. I mean, this is again a historical example, but I hope it's possible to kind of abstract that into a bigger thing on why the revolution needs to be international, right? And why revolutionary movements need to coordinate themselves internationally and to exchange information internationally. And being part of a kind of international working class party or association is a really important feature in that, I think, and learning from other examples and understanding what's going on in in more or less closer countries like Denmark, but what's going on in South America, what's going on in Brazil, what's going on in South Korea, because we also have a sister organization in South Korea, for example. And I think there's a lot of things and a lot of lessons that we can learn in the fight for socialism from this international perspective.
And just one thing of what you were saying, it would be very short, is like, when we hear these things, like it's super like, it builds your hope up a lot. And then maybe some people would accuse you of being utopianist. I know utopianist, like I know I've had it from family members and friends and stuff when I kind of like, you're talking about the issues of like one nation socialism, and you're like, well, obviously that just means that we need international socialism. And then they're like, oh, that's utopianist. That's some kind of weird dream. Like, we already live in an international global system. Capitalism is like, the ruling class cohort with each other and benefit and work with each other already. Like humans, why do we start thinking that humans are like stupid as soon as we start thinking about socialism? Like, we can figure this out. It's not like figuring it out won't be an issue. It's getting there. We can work globally as a central system for, like led by workers and just the actual people of each individual country. Not that countries will exist anyway, but it kind of just reminds me when I think of those things of this kind of thing that you hear a lot about the climate movement. Sorry for talking about it so much, but it's like it's easier to envision the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And that's kind of the options that we have right now. It is the end of the world or socialism. And we'll figure it out. We'll figure out how to do international socialism, because we've already figured out how to do international capitalism that benefits only 1% of people. Let's bring it to the wider masses of the world.
Thank you, thank you. Here's another question, and they're asking whether the panel, you, are for comprehensive socialism or just economic socialism. And in other words, should the society, culture, and the conduct of people also be socialist, or should it be liberal?
That's a more advanced question, I think. But I think I can still answer that. I think that we already indicated some of these things, right? I think that our needs in a socialist system will be different. I think we had some talk about human nature, and I think humans are really adapting to the conditions that they're in, right? So if we change the material conditions of the world that we live in, and the society that we live in, people will also behave in different ways. Like, if there is a thing as like greed in capitalist societies, because we get conditioned into that so much from the moment that we were born, practically. Well, from the moment we get to school, we get grades and all of these things. Anyways, and I think that there will inevitably be also a cultural revolution, right? There will be completely different ideas on how we can relate to each other, and different realities of relating to each other that are turning away from struggles and from struggles against each other and against other working people, and towards more solidarity. I think that that's a process that will naturally come. I think also art will have completely different perspectives, right? Like, this example of like how all movies under capitalism lately seem to be the same. Like, we're in the golden age of Netflix, but everything is the same. It's always like another Star Wars movie. No shade to Star Wars, but you know what I mean. It's essentially the same thing, like done over and over and over again. But I think if the profit motive is different, I think people will have way more chances to also culturally experiment, right, and to live on. Like, I always, when a show goes into the 5th season, I'm always like, capitalism killed the show, because it's just so crap, like, at this point. Anyways, what I'm trying to say with that is that, like, there will be massive cultural impulses that change society. And I think I'm wondering what they mean with this idea of if a society should be liberal, because there's a couple of different meanings to the word liberal as well. I guess this is about perhaps individual freedom. And I think these things that I'm laying out are examples of, more freedom of individuals to do what they want, to not be locked into one specific job that then they are. You will no longer be a baker or a garment worker or a teacher, but I think that will be one aspect of your life, right? Rather than this kind of entire identity. And that actually makes you a lot freer. Another thing is, and this is the question of individualism and collectivism, and I think that there's a dialectic relationship, like there's a relationship and how these things connect, right? Like, there's this idea that if we stand alone, then that's when we're free. And I think that's an individualist, capitalist, and liberal idea, right? But I think there's also different examples in history and different realities that say, actually, only if we act in collectives, and if we're protecting the society that we're in, that's the moment when we actually can say, I don't have to worry about all of these kind of things in life, like about, like, will I really have food tomorrow, or like, what's my future going to be like? If we can stop worrying about these things, that's actually when we become the individuals that we want to be, and that we can develop as free people. So I think that's if that was the intention with the question, it's kind of like the thing of like individualism versus collectivism. I think there will be synthesis of the two.
Yeah, and I guess I think Max answered that question really well. And my input would be, I guess the way that we look at it as Marxists is that the actual society that we live in and the objective kind of economic systems that we live in are completely entwined, and they aren't two separate forces. And so it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier, where some people just only focus on capitalism and exploitation, and not actually about sort of more small examples of like individual oppressions of identities and stuff. But there is like, and we have those kind of accusations, but there's also quite a lot of solace in this materialist understanding of oppression, where we say that, you know, the economic system creates oppression. It's a lot more complicated than that, but if we simplify it down to that, there is a lot of you know, there's a lot of hope in that, because, you know, the opposite, like the other options besides a material base for oppression based in exploitation and like economics would be in human nature or just in ideas that we can't change, you know, like what we're saying when we say that oppression is material is mean that we can change that. You know, it's not within human nature, which we can't change. Is if we change something materially, if we change the structures and the powers of the society that we live in, then inevitably the oppressions that people experience will also change with that. So, you know, they are entwined, and that actually that's the best thing about it, because like the human history is defined by change and we've got a long way ahead of us. We're not at the end of history, and I'm pretty sure that we will find more and more, you know, life will get better and better as long as we keep on fighting capitalism and inequality. So that's a bit of a cheesy way to end it.
No, thank you. I think it's a nice vision. And there's actually a question that was just posed, which was very closely related to the answer that Max just gave, which was, does the panel have any idea about what mechanism will govern the division of labor within a socialist society? So on what basis will someone become a doctor, but another person a farmer, for example?
I'm not too sure about this, to be honest. I think actually it was talking about the kind of division of labor and how it's done in capitalism with the comrade the other day. I'm not sure. I think part of it is doing what you want, right? And there being way more opportunities for people to also do several things and not locking themselves into one specific kind of profession. Although I also understand that there's very specific things for which you need a lot of training and a lot of knowledge, where perhaps it is important to have some more sense of that. But I think I don't know. I think human wants and desires on what to do with their lives and their time are very diverse. And I think because we're raised in capitalist society, we think, oh, everybody will want to become, I don't know, like one thing. Is that actually what we think? I don't even know if that's the reality. I don't even think that right now. I think people have very different, various different reasons and motivations to do things that are not always bound up with economy. I studied English literature. That was not an economic decision, but I assume since Abbie is in fashion, I don't know what the economic motivations behind that were. But it's certainly not, you know, no shade. But like it's certainly not something like kind of a business management thing or something where we like know in a way, well, that will really prepare us for the labor market, right? I think there's already now we see that people actually want to do so many different things, and other people, they say, hey, I actually really want to go into this. I really want to you know, learn about the economy and work with this kind of stuff. And I think those kind of jobs might still exist. They will probably be very different in a socialist society. But yeah, I think that's kind of partly my answer. I hope that kind of answers it to some extent, at least. That's also perhaps something for some more of the more advanced kind of talks that are upcoming on the kind of specific questions on like economy and how the division of labor will happen in these kind of societies. But I hope I gave at least a little like a window through which you can look into a kind of a different conceptualization of it.
Yeah, and to come back on that, I think you did answer it really well, Max. You hear this a lot. This is another thing that maybe we should have talked about in the common questions that we did during the opening discussion. It's kind of like the question of like, will a doctor get paid the same as a bin man or something? And like, it's kind of a similar question of like the division of labor, like who's going to be a farmer and who's going to be a doctor. And these things, you know, it's like we have to understand that the way that we understand labor right now is through a capitalist framework. Like we are very much under this understanding of labor through what like capitalism, and like why we think that a bin man or a farmer is different to a doctor is very much a class thing, because who has access to the amount of education? Like, I don't know what the case is around the world, but in England, higher education after the age of 18, to become a doctor, you need 8 years of education. This is very much a position that is held by the sort of privileged classes. And so like that's our understanding of the job now. We need to kind of, you know, really be very critical of what these jobs mean today and what they'll mean under socialism, when everyone has an equal right to education, you know. And so I don't think that we're going to end up with more doctors than farmers and more farmers than doctors. You know, people are defined by the experiences that they grew up around, and I think that we'll be just fine. But I do think that the shame of being a bin man won't be there, and the glorification of being a doctor. Although I'm not saying that doctors are overly glorified, but everyone has the same opportunities to save lives like doctors do. So yeah, it's definitely a question clouded by class connotations of labour.
If I can add a tiny thing to this, I think I heard the other day someone saying that, well, actually, if you think about it, if you abstract it a bit more, people that work in the kind of like that work as like cleaners or cleaning staff or bin men, that they're in a broader sense, perhaps even the same kind of industry as doctors, because they make sure that everyone in society remains healthy, right? And that public spaces are safe to be in and all of these things, and that and that again, with a different perspective on things, we actually value these kind of professions in a very different way. And again, also with the, you know, I think the example of the bin man, of people like picking up your trash or something like this. People say, oh, well, that's a really like undesirable job or something like this. I think that has a lot to do with how society views it, but also again, remember that these kind of things, there can be the way fewer hours invested into these things, right? Because at the moment we live in a system that really pushes for these ideas of full employment, and that needs kind of an unemployed reserve force almost, or something like this. But if more people work less hours, we can actually distribute these kind of jobs on a whole different way, on a social level, societal level.
Thank you. Then this we're nearing the last question, and I saved it for last, so maybe we could end on a kind of activist note. And it was, how can we use the current pandemic and the inevitable recession to spread our message? Go
Can I
ahead,
start
Max.
with that? Yeah, I
Sure.
think one of the things that is really interesting about the pandemic at the moment is, I mean, it shows again the contradictions of capitalism, right? This idea that at the moment, actually, instead of helping fight the coronavirus and the pandemic, the economy is actually one of the major obstacles that we kind of have to overcome, which is really strange if you think about it. I think in a socialist society we could do all sorts of different things with the economy in order to really help fight the pandemic. But I think another thing that this is doing is, and these are the kind of contradictions that a lot of people are becoming aware of, right? There's all of these conversations about rent strikes, and people are like, why the hell are we actually paying rent? Like, we're not being paid. There's somebody that has a piece of paper that says this apartment that I'm in right now is theirs. And I just, like, they literally do almost nothing to it. They probably didn't even build it. They just bought it off someone else, and we're giving them monthly money. Like, people are like, oh, what the fuck? It's a really strange concept. And it is, right? People are talking about how care work is super undervalued all of a sudden. They talk about how internet access should be like a human right because it's super vital in this pandemic. They talk about how kind of reproductive labor at home and taking care of people should be paid, perhaps, right? And there's also kind of projects that maybe we don't fully agree with, but they still show like the universal basic income. I think they still show this idea that people are beginning to think about all of these conversations that were really like marginal 2 or 3 months ago. People would be like, who's going to question rent, right? Like, that was a wild thing half a year ago. And now suddenly really broad masses of people are like, hey, hold up, that's a strange concept. And I think these are the kind of moments where it's actually really important, again, that we have a kind of tradition and a movement that we stand in that we can work together with, where we can say, actually, this is why this is happening. This is the reality of capitalism for these reasons. These are the ways that we can organize and struggle against it. And this is the way forward in a way, and draw from other people's experiences, of course, but kind of put them in a framework and a structure to struggle. I don't know if Abbie wants to say something on this. I also want to give some book recommendations before the end of this.
Okay, I'll just add on to what you said, and you said it so well. I guess the only thing that I really wanted to add is kind of like the thing that we take from this crisis is the fact that, like, I'm pretty sure globally, it's like one of the worst things to happen to the economy. Like, it's worse than the depression in the 1920s, and like that we saw such it, like, you know, capitalism as we know it now is over. Like, the capitalism that we're used to, like, I'm sorry everyone if you like, it's over. Like, there's nothing you can do, the economy is damned. But you know, when you look at like really influential parts of at least the last, like, the 20th century, all of these really important parts, whether it's the gains of the right or the left, have always been directly tied to the economy. When the economy is doing badly, it's the persistence of the success of ideas on the left and the right that really have shaped history after economic disaster. Um, and like, I think that this one, like, let's try and keep it really positive. I think that this one, like Max was saying, the nature of the pandemic has had to coincide with struggle of, you know, the loss of jobs, also a new kind of having to question the economy and the system as a whole. In England, we have our schools being opened way too early. Everyone, like, the teachers are pissed, and we can see that because when Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, said that the schools were going to open, the NEU, the Union for Educators, the website crashed that day because so many people were ready to join the union. As a socialist, we get excited about that. Like, you know, we had 20,000 teachers on a recent call because you have all of these teachers realizing that they don't, the state isn't there to support them, workers are there to support them, they need to support each other. And so, like, that's the positive note of this. Like, yeah, capitalism is over, but hopefully within this pandemic it offers up the questions that Max was presenting, and with that a lot of workers' consciousness.
Thank you.
I really agree. Is this the moment where I should do the book recommendations?
Yes, please.
I
Go
think
ahead.
I have three recommendations. I think one of the classic works is the Communist Manifesto, right, by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. I think this is like one of the kind of things that unites all of the kind of revolutionary traditions of socialism, even the ones that maybe we're at odds with, but everyone kind of goes back to this document, right? And kind of conceptualizes revolutionary change, capitalism as we know it, and how it changes the world, and also kind of gives the horizon of a different system and who should be struggling for it. Then there is this book called The Revolutionary Ideas of Karl Marx. Part of it, like a third, is really about Marx as a person, but there's actually a lot of really, really accessible information about the criticism of capitalism that we have, and also the kind of like conceptualizations of a different society. Look, you have the same books, exactly. They're classics. I'm telling you, you should get them. And another book that I unfortunately I gave to a friend because it's a really accessible, cool, short, and quick read. Oh yes, 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 yes. Sorry, this book is also to be discussed in the reading group coming Sunday. It will be in Dutch, the reading group, but I'm sure you can also participate as a non-Dutch speaker. Well, if you understand Dutch, that is, like me. Um, so, but if you're Dutch, I think you can probably find this online as well. The Revolutionary Ideas of Karl Marx by Alex Kalinikos. He's from the Socialist Workers' Party, and you can participate in that meeting. You can find the meetings on our Facebook. And then the last book that I wanted to give a shout out to that I don't have because I gave it to a friend because it's such a good like introduction to our politics and our ideas. It's called The Point is to Change It. And it's by the author John Molyneux, who's also part of our international tendency, the International Socialist Tendency. The Point is to Change It by John Molyneux. It's a really kind of pretty short book that really goes into kind of Marxist philosophy, and also part of Marxist philosophy is to say not just interpret the world in different ways, but to change it, right? That's where this comes from. So that's a really cool, accessible thing. If you want to find out more about this, these are three books that are cool to start with.
Thank you so much, Max. Then we've come up to our time for today. And I would like to end with a very warm thank you to the speakers for your very insightful discussions today. And hopefully everyone who's been watching might feel like they have a little bit more clarity about what socialism is. The next sessions in the Marxism meetings that are coming up are the reading group that was just mentioned about the revolutionary ideas of Karl Marx in Dutch on Sunday. and an interview with the French socialist John Mullen, which will be in English again, on Thursday the 28th of May. And tomorrow, even, you can tune in to watch a recording by international socialist Michel Tilanes for a Marxist perspective on the new economic crisis. Now, that will be a bit more advanced Marxist theory for those who might be interested after this talk today. Now, we, the International Socialists, print a monthly newspaper called The Socialist. And usually we're on the streets to distribute the paper, but because that's impossible currently, the newest May edition is fully readable online right now. Lastly, if all of this talk might have gotten you a bit interested in perhaps joining the International Socialists, then there will be a link commented to a document where you can enter some information to maybe get into contact with us. I believe you will find those in the comments. Now, I hope you all enjoyed watching along, and if you did, we will now open the Zoom room for anyone who wants to have a little after chat. So if you're interested in joining, just post that in the comments and we'll see you here in a little bit. Thanks again to the speakers and to everybody watching, and I wish everybody a great rest of the evening and weekend.
Fantastic sharing, Emma. Very good sharing.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank
It was
you.
great.
Bye-bye. Thank you for having me.